एक प्यार। Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Hi, it is me, Bibi. And I'm still, in my wonderful three-dimensional form. Um, so today we are going to. Oh, wait. We are going to read the not the third, but the fourth chapter of Renato Constantino's The Philippines, A Past Revisited. But before that, how are you, my little ducklings? Hello. If there are any background noises that you're hearing right now, please don't mind it. It's just my snail making my coffee. So, how about you guys? Have you had coffee? And for Magindara, who is on the other side of the world, have you had dinner? Background noises, but hey, I keep on getting distracted. I look very, very wonderfully 3D. Burger too big, mouth too small. I think that's a good thing. Big burgers. I'm actually craving for some fast food for the past few hours. I've been awake since this morning. I woke up to a Minukawa screaming, "Mommy, mommy." And no, he does not call me mommy. He was just screaming mommy. I forgot what the context was, but I was sleeping in the voice channel in a private server with a few other people, including him, but I think they were... Oh! Meowkey08, thank you for the follow! Hi, welcome to my stream. Oh, Emmy, you're playing League as breakfast? I can't really say that I'm any better because my breakfast was Valorant. Hello, welcome. Thank you for subscribing, and I hope you enjoy the next 2 hours, or so I hope. I don't really know if I'll take a little bit longer than that, but I hope to finish this chapter in 2 hours. So where was I? Oh yeah, I woke up to Mino screaming mommy, and I was like having a nightmare, and his voice was overlapping, and it was just so weird. In my dream, we were being chased by a ghost, and we were at his hobo house. I know this sounds all so weird out of context, but bear with me. So we were running away from this ghost from his hobo house, and I was headed to my place because I know that... Yes, Magindara. It's the Mino no hobo hole. I hate it. I hate it so much. So yeah, we were running away from a ghost. I think we were riding a motorcycle or something, and I woke up to him screaming mommy, mommy, because I think I remember now. They were discussing the plot of this horror movie, and yeah, I think that induced the nightmare for me because I was in a VC with them while they were talking and I was sleeping. Will that prevent me from being in a voice channel while asleep for the next few days? Probably not. Anyway, I can smell the coffee. It's wonderful. We shall now go to my reading screen. Hold on, let me just move it a bit. Okay, there we are. Oh, by the way, if you were wondering what our background music is, it is from Pyolhae는 Darakbam Starry Attic or Daystar. The title of the song is AM 5 o'clock, and it's royalty free music. You can find them on Facebook. I mean, not Facebook, YouTube. You can find them on YouTube. You may use their wonderful music for, background when you stream or when you study, if you do study, or work if you're working. Well, for now, we are going to study, and here, as you can see, we are already on chapter 4. I'm planning to finish this book before we move on to another one. I've put my Tianguan Shifu reading or Heaven Official's Blessing book reading for this one because I think it's more important, because I have seen that a lot of people, even in this community, have been forgetting our history. Oh, Mino! I have been talking about you earlier. I told them that I woke up to your screaming. And I had a nightmare with you in it, which is weird because obviously I have never seen him aside from his two-dimensional form. So yes, we are going to start with chapter 4 of Renato Constantino's The Philippines, a past revisited, but where the title is Pacification and Exploitation. What do you mean I'm welcome? No, it was horrible. I'm not thanking you for anything. Anyway, let's start. Magellan's voyage to the East Indies fired the ambition of many Spaniards for similar expeditions of discovery and conquest. The Spanish monarchs themselves were anxious to expand their empire and to protect their claimed domains in the East from their rivals, again the Portuguese. They were equally interested in bringing back to Mexico and Spain the gold and spices thought to be abundant in the Isles of the West, Las Islas del Poniente, the Spanish name for the East Indies from the Philippines to New Guinea. When King Philip of Spain decided to finance an expedition to the East Indies, both his mercantilist motives and his concern with the rivalry between Spain and Portugal were evident in his instructions. Crown and Conquistador. Charged by the king to organize the expedition, the Spanish viceroy in Mexico gave its command to Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, a Spanish colonist who had arrived in Mexico in 1530 and made his fortune there. The viceroy told his friend Legazpi that the purpose of the voyage was to secure a foothold in the Indies, outside the area granted the Portuguese under the Alexandrian donation. So you remember the Alexandrian donation? We've discussed it a few streams ago, where basically it's like the church said, oh, you may have claim over this land, and you may have claim over this land, even if they don't really have any claim over these lands, because they're what? They are colonists. They don't belong there. They don't belong here. Anyway, Legazpi was also charged with the task of finding a way back to Mexico by sailing eastward so that gold and spices of the region could be brought back without running afoul of the Portuguese, who by papal edict had jurisdiction over the western parts of the Indies. Legazpi was further informed that although his expedition was being financed by the royal treasury, some demands on his private fortune were expected. However, if he succeeds in founding a settlement in the Indies, he was to be rewarded with 4,000 ducats and with the concessions for trade, mining, and pearl fisheries, as well as with other honors. So it was not just money. There are many other things that he was going to receive if he succeeds in, basically colonizing what they call the Indies. Let's continue. Agreeing to the terms, Legazpi began to spend his own funds in the course of the preparations. Because, basically he was putting in money for a bigger return. Even selling his hacienda in Michoacan for 40,000 pesos. I'm not really sure if this is pesos as in Philippine pesos or pesos what's the other country that uses pesos? Is it Mexico or I forgot. Anyway, by the time his fleet of ships sailed from the port of La Navidad, Mexico on November 20, 1564, oh, my coffee has arrived, he had already spent 100,000 pesos of his own. So I'm assuming that this money is like 1564 money, and you can just imagine how big it is converted to today's money because of inflation. The voyage was something like a high-risk business venture with a possibility of tremendous profit. So just like I said earlier, he was putting in the money because this is a business venture. Hunger for riches was the strong motivating factor for such expeditions, from the Spanish monarchs down to the lost sailor of the ships. Let me just take a sip from my coffee. Wonderful. Thus, Legazpi sought not just honor, but great wealth as conquistador. This type of contractual agreement for exploration and colonization, which had its origins in the practices of the Reconquista, like we discussed in Chapter 2, in turn provided the basis for the exploitative policies of the officers sent by the crown to newly conquered lands. Because, they were not just coming there for glory or anything. They were there for the money. It's basically exploiting, quote unquote, undiscovered lands wherein there are already people. So it's not really undiscovered. So what are they going to do with the people? Okay, where are we? Legazpi and his successors instituted certain measures for the pacification of the people, the better to pursue their private goals of enrichment, while at the same time consolidating the rule of Spain in what was to be an outpost of empire in this part of the globe. The instruments of pacification thus served the dual purpose of strengthening Spanish sovereignty and of enriching the men who had made possible the annexation of the territory. The terms of agreement drawn up in 1578 between Philip II and Gonzalo Ronquillo de Peñalosa reveals this dual purpose clearly. Ronquillo found himself to finance an expedition of 600 men, in consideration for which he was appointed governor of the Philippines for life, promised an encomienda in each major town, and empowered to fill certain administrative positions with men of his choice. In effect, he had royal sanction to recover his investment and more through the use of his public office. And you would think that this sort of thing is like very, very backwards, but I can still see it to this day in our public offices. I'm so sorry for everyone. It's still a thing where people put in money to gain power so that in return they can use that power to gain more money than they invested. So it's sort of like a fucked up business. Barring a few exceptions, subsequent governors and other officials regarded public office as a golden opportunity to make their fortune as quickly as possible. Needless to say, this attitude spawned rampant graft and corruption, much injustice and cruel exploitation of the people. So if you're asking where the culture of graft and corruption here in the Philippines came from, there you have your answer, my dear ducklings. Hold on, let me just move this. Okay, there we go. Origins of the encomienda. One institution that served both as an instrument of pacification and personal enrichment during the early part of the conquest was the encomienda. Etymologically, the word encomienda is derived from the verb encomendar, meaning to commend or to commit or to charge to one's care. A definite number of souls or inhabitants of a territory were entrusted to the care of an encomendero. Originally, the encomienda was a feudal institution used in Spain during the Reconquista to reward deserving generals and conquerors. But since the Reconquista itself was part of the capitalist impulse of the time, it is not surprising that after its introduction to the West Indies, this feudal institution underwent several transformations, reflecting the development of the Spanish economic base from feudal to capitalist. The crown delegated to the earliest encomenderos in the West Indies the power to collect tribute and to use the personal services of the inhabitants of their encomiendas. In return, the encomenderos were supposed to look after the welfare of the natives and to give them some education. Let me just take a sip of my coffee. The encomenderos exercised their powers and prerogatives to the full, but for the most part ignored their duties and treated the natives as their slaves. So originally, on paper, it sounds like the encomienda system was like something that is mutual. The souls or the inhabitants would give money to the person in power, and the person in power is going to look after them. These encomenderos would also give them education, but the latter part was largely ignored, and thus we have something very akin to slavery. Taming the encomiendas. Because of the abuses of the encomenderos, advocates of the suppression of this institution succeeded in persuading Charles V to decree the abolition of the encomiendas in 1542. But the encomenderos protested, and supported by royal officials in the colonies, were able to extend the life of the institution under a compromise which forbade the use of Indians. And when I say Indians, I don't mean the people who live in India or American Indians for whatever reason. It means people in the Indies, our ancestors, in the mines, and the commutation of the tribute into personal services of whatever kind. Tribute was to be paid in money or in produce. Additional decrees had the intention of further humanizing the encomienda, thus prompting the historians to refer to it as its last period in Hispanic America as tamed encomienda. Because, it's a little more, I don't know if it's acceptable, but yes, it's a little more acceptable than what it used to be. It is, of course, doubtful that these prohibitions against the inhuman abuses of encomenderos were complied with to a significant degree. However, the attitude of the Crown towards this institution and the regulations it tried to enforce provide us with a useful background for understanding the various regulations governing the encomienda as subsequently established in the Philippines. It should be noted that although the encomenderos and the New World behaved as feudal lords, the enterprises they headed and the gold mines they operated were in furtherance of the mercantilist objectives of Spain. So basically, they just took the worst of mercantilism and feudalism and mashed them together. The establishment of the feudal structure was thus induced by the capitalist impulsions of mercantilist Spain. Evidently, the Crown was aware of the natural affinity between the encomienda and the fief, for it took pains to avert the rise of feudal principalities which could challenge the royal jurisdiction. The limitation which Ferdinand and Isabella originally placed in the encomiendas in the New World clearly indicate this objective. Although the Spanish monarchs allowed encomiendas in the New World, they were careful to preserve the rights of the Crown. They did not want the encomienda system to give rise to a feudal aristocracy. They decreed that all uninhabited islands or uninhabited lands should be reserved for the Crown, thus forestalling a repetition of what happened during the Reconquista, when nobles extended their domains without royal authority by simply taking possession of unoccupied lands. The royal couple was quite niggardly in granting titles of nobility and carefully limited the amount of lands under the jurisdiction of each encomendero. Encomiendas were not hereditary beyond the third or at most the fourth generation, and when they fell vacant, most of them were supposed to revert to the Crown, thus ensuring the eventual demise of the institution. So basically, what they did was leasing the lands to these encomenderos for maybe up to the third or fourth generation, and then after that, the land goes back to the royal crown, which is the king and queen. Philippine encomienda, not a land grant. In view of the foregoing, it is not surprising that Legazpi's instructions did not bestow on him any encomiendas nor empower him to grant the same to his men. However, when Legazpi arrived in Cebu, he found a people whose primitive economy produced barely enough for their subsistence. Certainly, the booty that, well, not the booty as in ass, but the loot that had made the fortunes of the Spanish conquistadores of the New World was not to be had in the island, meaning he can't really loot the place when it's obviously fucking poor. Pleading the poverty of his men, Legazpi asked for a just reward for their services to the crown, because he did invest in this, and he got here and saw that, oh no, they don't really have the riches that I'm expecting to be looting. So he's like, yo bro, King Ferdinand, can you give me something, because obviously there's nothing here. The king granted his request. By the time Legazpi died in 1572, he had assigned 143 encomiendas to his men. Guido de Lavezares, his successor, not only assigned new encomiendas, but even reassigned those that fell vacant, thus disregarding explicit orders that such vacant encomiendas should revert to the crown. Like its Latin American model, the encomienda in the Philippines was not a land grant. It was an administrative unit for the purpose of exacting tribute from the natives. Theoretically, each encomendero in whose care a native settlement was entrusted had a threefold responsibility. So, what are the three responsibilities? The first one is to protect the natives by maintaining peace and order within the encomienda. This is the most important thing, protection. Number two is to support the missionaries in their work of converting the people to Catholicism. Because again, remember, they went here for 3 Gs: gold, God, and glory, by request maybe of Isabella, because she is a very, very devout Catholic. Number three, to help in the defense of the colony. So yeah, defending the colony. It's important if they want to continue collecting tribute. In return for these services, the crown authorized the encomendero to collect a tribute of 8 reales annually from all male inhabitants of his encomienda between the ages of 19 and 60. His share was not supposed to exceed 1/4 of the total collection. So there was like a division of how much he is supposed to be able to keep for himself. Part of the tribute was to go to the friars, the rest to the government. The tribute was payable in money or its equivalent in kind. The chiefs, now called cabezas de barangay, were usually charged with the duty of collecting the tribute and forwarding it to the encomendero who lived in the pueblo or even in the capital. The law of the Indies contains a provision forbidding encomenderos to own a house in the native settlements within their encomiendas. So, for example, if you are managing, quote unquote, an encomienda somewhere, like let's say you're in Quezon City, you cannot stay there. Your house is going to be elsewhere, like maybe in BGC or something. While this prohibition was supposedly intended to minimize abuses by encomenderos, the rule also served to prevent them from consolidating their control over the area inhabited by natives under their jurisdiction, a royal precaution that helped to ensure the primacy of the king in his Latin American colonies. So you will see the trend here. The crown is installing all these rules and regulations for these encomenderos so that they would be sure that they would still be in power instead of little kings developing. The laws of the Indies were supposed to apply to the Philippines. However, in his instructions to Governor Gomez Perez Dasmariñas, King Philip II did urge that encomenderos be encouraged to reside near their wards, the better to take care for the latter's welfare. But the amenities of urban life and the lure of the latter's welfare, lure of profits to be made from the China trade, made most encomenderos prefer to locate themselves in the city. An encomendero did not own the land inhabited by his indios. He and his heirs could hold the encomienda for only 2 lifetimes, sometimes 3, after which it reverted back to the crown. When a native died, the encomendero had no right to his property. The right descended to the heirs of the native. In the event that he had no heirs, the property was given to the town or village to which he belonged so that the community could use it to help pay its tribute assessment. Abuses of the encomenderos. Now we are going to the spicy stuff. But these limitations on the encomenderos did not prevent them from committing abuses, as you already know. The encomienda system was generally characterized by greed and cruelty. the benevolent tenor of the terms of the encomienda concealed the basic purpose of this grant, as the grantee saw it. For the encomendero, this grant was nothing more than an opportunity to enrich himself. Again, it boils down to these encomenderos getting richer. And he used every opportunity open to him, whether in the collection of tributes or in the unlawful exaction of numerous services. Despite the prohibition against draft labor, the encomenderos invariably require the people and their encomiendas to serve them in various ways. Oh, hi! Tan! Hello, 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 hello! You're sleepy. Don't worry, I would understand if you fall asleep. You can use my voice as an ASMR. We are currently reading Philippine history. We are talking about the encomiendas. Basically, we are at Spanish colonization era. So, yes, I hope you have fun listening. Okay, let's continue. Again, despite the prohibition against draft labor, the encomenderos invariably require the people of their encomiendas to serve them in various ways. So here is what Antonio de Morga has written. They employ the Indians, and when I say Indians, I mean Indios, the Filipinos, in building houses and large vessels, grinding rice, cutting wood, and carrying it all to their houses and to Manila, and then pay them little or nothing for their labor. Regarding the collection of tributes, Fray Domingo de Salazar, in his memorial to the king in 1583, described the brutalities inflicted by the encomenderos in these words. I can find no words to express to your majesty the misfortunes, injuries, and vexations, the torments and miseries which the Indians are made to suffer in the collection of the tributes. If the chief does not give them as much gold as they demand, or does not pay for as many Indians as they say there are, they crucify the unfortunate chief or put his hand in the stocks, for all the encomenderos, when they go to collect, have their stocks, and there they lash and torment the chiefs until they give the entire sum demanded from them. Sometimes the wife or daughter of the chief is seized when he himself does not appear. Many of the chiefs who have died of torture in the manner which I have stated, one who was collecting the tributes killed a chief by crucifixion and hanging him by the arms. Likewise, I learned that an encomendero, because a chief had neither gold nor silver nor cloth with which to pay the tribute, exacted from him an Indian for 9 pesos in payment of 9 tributes which he owed, and then took this Indian to the ship and sold him for 35 pesos. They collect tribute from children, old men, and slaves, and many remain unmarried because of the tribute, while others kill their children. As agents of Spanish power and for their own personal gain, the encomenderos, like the various government officials who would later take over their functions, made so many cruel exactions from the population that they reduced the natives to a state of degradation, such as these had never experienced before. As far as the colonized areas were concerned, instances of actual slavery in the classic sense were a Spanish transplantation, because for those of you who had not been here last time that we streamed this book, there was no concept of classical slavery in the Philippines, or the islands that we know now as the Philippines. What we call alipin, or what they translated as slaves, are not really slaves, but people with debt. So when you're indebted to someone, you're supposed to pay them, right? And when they cannot pay them, they pay them with service. They basically live with them. They stay there as servants. And when they are able to pay their debts, they become free men, basically. So it's not really slavery. Slavery here in the Philippines was something that the Spanish had brought. Administrative agencies. The encomienda was an integral part of the early Spanish administrative machinery. Besides being rewards for supposedly deserving individuals, the encomiendas were established as a means of hastening the pacification of the Philippines and to give some measure of local government and control. These encomiendas served as political units along with the regular provinces, corregimientos, and other agencies for administration. In the beginning, it was the encomenderos who performed the functions of provincial officers. Certain encomiendas were reserved for the crown. These were under the care of alcalde mayores, the heads of the alcaldes or provinces. They supervised the tax collection from the crown encomiendas and were responsible only to the royal officials in Manila. As more and more private encomiendas reverted to the crown, the power of the alcalde mayores increased. No exact date for the abolition of the private encomienda can be given. However, it had already declined by the middle of the 17th century. And in 1721, a cedula provided that henceforth encomiendas that fell vacant were not to be reassigned to private persons or to charitable institutions, but were to revert to the crown as they intended. Hold on, let me just clean up a bit over here because my iced coffee is sweating. It is appropriate at this point to differentiate between the hacienda and the encomienda in order to dispose of the ancient myth that the Philippine hacienda grew out of the encomienda. Okay, what is the difference? While both were forms of colonial appropriation, they were not the same, and one did not necessarily lead to the other. The exploitative practices of the encomienda were not based on land ownership. The exactions of the encomendero were incidental to their positions as representatives of the king. In the hacienda, the exploitative relations are based on and grow out of the ownership of the landlord of the tracts of land from which the tenants derive their livelihood. By virtue of his ownership of the land, the haciendero has the right of inheritance and free disposition, two rights not covered by an encomienda grant. The exploitation by the encomenderos was direct and undisguised. They exacted tribute and drafted labor. The haciendero, on the other hand, disguises his exploitation with the fiction of partnership. And this still kind of happens today. Hence the term kasamahan to denote a joint venture, and the reference to the tenant as a kasama or companion. Moreover, whereas the amount of tribute was a fixed amount, the fiction of a joint undertaking is maintained in sharecropping in terms of sharing of risks. It may also be pointed out that tributaries generally regarded the tribute as an unwarranted exaction, but tenants still recognized the right of the haciendero to a lion's share of their produce by virtue of his ownership of the land. To determine the real historical origins of the hacienda and of the feudal practices that adhere to it, one must not look to the encomienda as its progenitor. The vast haciendas were products of a latter development and not of the encomienda system. Proof of this is that while the number of private encomiendas had rapidly declined by 1755, large latifundia did not become significant until the 19th century, which we will be discussing in chapters 9 and 10. Furthermore, the habitual absence of the encomenderos from their encomiendas militated against their acquiring of ownership of land occupied by their tributaries. This was not, however, true for the religious. Unlike the encomenderos, the religious lived with their flock and thus had better opportunities to acquire land holdings, whether within the area of encomiendas or outside them. From the royal domain, as well as from the natives, they acquired their estates through various means. From all the foregoing, it may be safely concluded that encomienda was not the origin of the present system of land tenure. And yes, this still exists. There are still haciendas. There's one near me. It's the Hacienda Luisita. Instruments of pacification. Both of the encomenderos and the government officials were instruments of pacification and exploitation. This exploitation, basic to all colonization, was made more cruel and onerous by the personal greed of Spanish colonial administrators. Exactions took various forms, such as the tribute, forced labor, the bandala, which we will be seeing later on, and military conscription. All these exactions assumed greater urgency and were therefore collected or enforced with greater severity during those periods when Spain was at war. During the early years of the occupation, Spain was at war with the Portuguese and the Dutch. Spain was using the islands as a base for operations against her rivals. The Philippines was under constant attack or threat of attack from these other powers. The Portuguese harassed Legazpi in 1567 and asked him to leave Cebu on the ground that the Spaniards were violating Portugal's rights to the area. When Legazpi refused to heed their warnings, the Portuguese, under the command of General Gonzalo de Pereira, attacked Cebu in 1568 and blockaded its harbor. In 1570, the Portuguese again tried to land but were repulsed. Such harassments ended only after the annexation of Portugal by Spain in 1580. The 80 Years' War between the Dutch and the Spaniards began in 1568. After the union of the crowns of Portugal and Spain, the Dutch seized Portuguese colonies in the east. The Dutch, under Admiral von Noort, first attacked the Philippines in 1600. Dutch incursions into Philippine waters continued up to 1647. A year later, the Treaty of Westphalia ended the war between Spain and the Netherlands. To finance the expeditions of Spain against her enemies, tribute had to be exacted at all costs. Labor had to be recruited for building of ships. Rowers had to be forced to man these ships, and fighting men had to be conscripted to beef up the Spanish forces. In addition, the government commanded rice supplies, giving in return mere promises to pay, which were honored only partially, if at all. Hold on. Hold on. My browser encountered an error. Let me just refresh it quickly. Let's see. Okay, now it is kind of working. Let us continue. The social and economic distress that each of these Spanish impositions inflicted on the population can be fully appreciated only if it is borne in the mind that both labor and produce were being forcibly extracted from an economy that had hardly any surplus of either. It's basically, imagine a rich person robbing a poor person in broad daylight. That's what it is. Social units largely dependent on subsistence agriculture were suddenly being compelled to yield a surplus to support a group of people who did no work at all. Colonial exploitation was therefore intensified to a critical degree by the exigencies of war, by the avarice of the colonizers, and by the low productivity of local economy. An economy which the Spaniards did very little to develop in the first 300 years of their rule. The tribute. Because it was exacted throughout the archipelago and was collected from Legazpi's time until 1884, the tribute was the imposition most consistently complained of. It was levied on all Filipinos from 19 to 60, with the exception of incumbent gobernadorcillos and cabezas and their families, government employees, soldiers with distinguished service, descendants of Lacandula, and a few other native chieftains, choir members, sacristanes, and the porters of the churches, also exempted government witnesses. The tribute collectors, who are the alcalde mayores, encomenderos, gobernadorcillos, the cabezas, often abused their offices by collecting more than the law required. So you can imagine, encomienda on its own is basically robbing the poor, and the people who collected the tributes rob them even more than what is sanctioned by the law. So you can imagine how horrible it was. Okay, they often abuse their offices by collecting more than the law required and appropriating the difference. The act itself of collecting was the occasion for much cruelty because, the things that we mentioned earlier, if they can't pay, they get harassed, they get treated cruelly. Some of them, well, if we were to believe the accounts of the friars, they were put in crosses or basically hang on like somewhere, and they're going to be lashed. Since the people did not regard the exaction of tribute to be justified, obviously they hated it, they often defied the authorities and refused to pay it. Historical accounts contain numerous references to communities which refused to submit to this imposition. Encomenderos often had to send soldiers to collect the tribute by force. Many who did not pay or could not pay were tortured or imprisoned. Others fled to the mountains only to have their houses looted or burned down by the Spaniards in punishment for the defiance. A more sophisticated method of abuse took advantage of the proviso that the tribute could be paid in cash or kind by depriving the people of their right to choose the form of payment. The tribute collector could increase the profits from his office. During periods when money was scarce or produce plentiful, the alcalde or the encomendero required payment in cash. When there was scarcity of goods and prices were high, he insisted on payment in goods, which he then sold at the prevailing high prices. Goods offered as tribute payments were invariably underpriced. Basically, what they're doing is scalping. So, if things were expensive, they would require it to be in kind so they can sell it, right? And basically, if money was hard, they would take money as payment. You can never win with these people. The amount of tribute may seem small to us who take a money economy for granted, but it was a heavy load for a people who were just evolving a money economy. Because remember, before the Spaniards came, the economy was basically non-existent. They had little societies. They traded occasionally. It's not even like a systematic trade, it's by occasion. And they live on a subsistence type of farming, meaning they didn't have excess. They only planted what they would eat for that time period. They did not have that much product to trade. So this whole money concept, it's kind of new, and they were being taxed really, really ridiculously by the encomenderos. On the other hand, the fact that the amount of tribute required rose from the original 8 reales to only 12 in 1851 and 14 by 1874, a total span of almost 3 centuries, surely reflects the lack of economic progress in the islands. Because as you can notice, as your economy grows, there's just basically more money to go around and things will be more expensive. And if things stay the same relatively, it means that your economy isn't really progressing. And that's the case for the archipelago during that time. Forced labor. In addition to the tribute, men between ages of 16 and 60, except chieftains and their eldest sons, were required to do for 40 days each year the labor pool or polo. This was instituted in 1580 and reduced to 15 days per year only in 1884. So if you were born in the 90s, you would recognize this thing as polo y servicios or something like that. That's what the term that they used in elementary textbooks. The regulations on the polo provided for a payment of 1/4 or a quarter real a day plus rice to each polista. In addition, the polista was not supposed to be brought to a distant place nor required to work during the planting and harvesting seasons. So the polista are the people who are required to do the service, the polo. Private enterprises and public works of a non-military nature were not to use polo labor. Also, the government was not supposed to use polistas if voluntary Chinese labor was available. All these conditions were violated with impunity, especially when the exigencies of war required the impressment of a large labor pools to fell trees for the constructions of ships. Polistas were also recruited to man these vessels, a duty which took them far away from their homes for many months. Others were forced to work in mines. Again, if you would remember, forcing the people to work in mines was prohibited in the law. Forced labor often resulted in the ruin of the communities. The men left behind. So, since polo laborers were seldom paid, their villages were forced to provide them with a monthly allowance of 4 pesos worth of rice to keep them alive. This burden was made doubly onerous by the fact that the absence of these men caused a manpower shortage. Shortage of manpower meant abandoned fields. As a consequence, many people died of hunger. So imagine your town right now. They take all the able-bodied men away to work for basically for free. And since they are working for free, they don't have any money to feed themselves. So you will also have to send money to your father and brothers. And who is earning the money? No one, because the men are out there. They can't really plant in the fields, which is like the main thing back then. So what would happen? Basically, all these communities, there was nothing to keep them afloat. They went hungry. Fray Pedro de San Pablo, writing in 1620 to the Spanish king regarding compulsory service, revealed other evil consequences of the practices in these words. When personal services are commanded, the Indian, in order not to go to the forests to cut and haul the wood, subject to the cruel treatment of the Spaniard, incurred debt, and borrowed some money at usury, and for the month falling to him, he gave another Indian 6 or 7 reales of 8 at his own cost, in order that the other should go on in his stead. So basically, six. Basically, they would give someone 6. Wait, what is that? He gave another Indian 6 or 7 reales. So, basically paying them, you go instead of me because I don't want to leave my family. And not a lot of them had the money to do that. So where did they get the money? They would basically borrow it. They would go in debt. He who was taxed as his share 1/2 arroba of oil went, if he did not have it from his own harvest, to the rich man who gathered it, and not having the money here wherewith to buy it, he became the other man's slave, or borrowed the money at usurious rates. Thus, in the space of 10 years, did the country become in great measure ruined. Some natives took to the woods, others were made slaves, many others were killed, and the rest were exhausted and ruined. The corruption and greed of alcaldes compounded the misery of the people. Alcaldes were often drafted They often drafted hundreds more men than was necessary for woodcutting and shipbuilding. Then they pocketed the money that many draftees paid to be exempted from work. So if you don't want to be drafted, you have to pay. And since there's money in it, they would be drafting more people than what is actually needed. So they would have more money. Okay. Gobernador Cilios made money too by cornering the business of supplying the work gangs with their needs. Work gangs averaged 1,000 a month, but sometimes numbered as many as 6,000 to 8,000 men. So as you can see, everyone in the government back then, the Spaniards basically, made a lot of money at the expense of the natives suffering. Now we are going to discuss the bandala that we mentioned earlier. You might also recognize this because this was discussed in high school, I think. First year high school. Another exploitative device was instituted by Governor Sebastián Hurtado de Corcuera during the first half of the 17th century. This was the bandala. Oh! Thank you for the stretch, Aya, and Milky 08. Oh, they redeemed Curse at Me money. Milky, fuck you. Thank you for the redeem. We are now going back to our regular programming. Okay. It consisted of the assignment of annual quotas to each province for the compulsory sale of products to the government. Provincial quotas were subdivided among the towns. Since the government claimed not to have enough funds, the bandala meant virtual confiscation. All the people got were promissory notes, which were seldom redeemed in full. To compound the abuse, the prices the government set were lower than the prevailing prices of these products, so that if a person could not fill his quota with his own produce, he had to buy at a higher price in order to sell at a lower rate to the government, which seldom paid anyway. Again, let's kind of explain it. Imagine your government is buying your product, and when they pay you, it's basically lower than market price, so you're already losing money there. And not only that, it was paid in checks, but the checks were bouncing checks because the government doesn't have the money. So you're not really earning any money by doing business with the government, but they require you to do so. And if you do not have enough product, now you have to buy product from someone else. So you buy these products and then you quote unquote sell it to the government, which was basically giving it away for free. So it was a big financial strain to the people. The mandala caused the people a great deal of suffering. Even if rats or drought destroyed their crops, they still had to buy rice in order to give it to the government on credit. Moreover, Spanish officials often collected more than was assessed and pocketed the difference. Again, they were very, very corrupt. The excessive assessments forced many natives to become indebted to the chiefs, thus entrenching the socio-economic position of these local leaders. By the first decades of the 17th century, the government already owed the different provinces millions of pesos, and this was what, 17th century money? Imagine how much that is in today's money. Divide and rule. The Spaniards never had a large military contingent in the Philippines. Spanish soldiers had to be backed up by locally recruited forces. Applying the age-old technique of divide and rule, the Spaniards were able to avail themselves of the services of local mercenaries. Recruitment was facilitated by the lack of a national consciousness. Each locality regarded itself as a separate and apart from the others, so that invariably the Spaniards were able to use native troops from one region to put down revolts in other regions. So they're pitting Filipinos against other Filipinos because, they were basically separate from each other. They don't think that they are, we're one nation. They think, we're basically just following orders from the Spaniards, and now we have to go and smash this other troop from this region. So that's how they quelled the revolutions back then. It would take centuries of common grievances to develop a consciousness of national solidarity. So as you can see, it took them a long, long time, centuries, 3 centuries to be exact, to actually, have enough power to go together, unite, and realize that, we have the same goal here, to basically send away these colonizers. Meanwhile, the native constabulary was a reliable source of strength for the Spanish colonialists. The Spaniards set up a separate army modeled after the Spanish military organization, with native officers bearing high-sounding ranks such as Capitan and Maestre de Campo, trained in European military science. These troops formed the bulk of the Spanish fighting force against Spain's foreign enemies, as well as against domestic rebels, meaning the Filipinos themselves. The Intermediaries. The encomienda system was the first administrative agency of Spanish colonization. It was segmented and later supplanted by an administrative network which took over its functions of pacification and exploitation. These interrelated colonial goals could hardly be achieved, however, by the small Spanish community alone. The Spaniards conscripted native mercenaries for pacification, and so did they enlist through a combination of coercion and accommodation. The participation of the traditional native leaders in the exploitation of their communities, the roles assigned to them in extracting the tribute, the polo and the bandala, inevitably contraposed them to their countrymen when they took advantage of their positions to enrich themselves. The cleavage became both political and economic. These leaders of the native communities were thus transformed into pillars of colonial administration and intermediaries between the rulers and the ruled. And that is the end of chapter 4. We are now in chapter 5, colonial landscape. But before that, let's take a short break to have a little chat. How are you all feeling? Cleavage. I love cleavages, except this one. Basically, yeah, they divided the people who aren't even united to begin with. They divided them in their own communities because back then, before they were there, the community leaders, they were very, very, well, if not equal, they were like basically brothers, families to the community. They respected and loved them. But through, you know, this, I don't know what to call it, assigning power to them from the Spanish crown, and they started learning the abusive and what do you call, how would I describe it? Basically, they were taking advantage of their own countrymen, and so there was division. And if there's division, it is harder for them to revolt because they would be against each other. They can't be fighting the forces that are keeping them down if they are fighting among themselves, right? Oh, you haven't listened to any sort of textbook reading in years? Well, this is a good start, although Tan is from the United States, so he doesn't really know much about our history. It's a good time to learn about it. I mean, well, we are going to be discussing relations between America and the Philippines later on, I believe. But that's much, much later on because Spanish era is very, very long. It took 300 years, more than 300 years, before they finally left us alone, only to sell us to America. I'm just sipping my coffee here. Little ducklings, how are you feeling? Can you hear? Yes, that is my metal straw clinking on my cup. I'm having a very, very milky coffee because I plan to go to sleep after this stream. I didn't have much sleep. The people from the hole would know why. Hold on, let us continue reading the colonial landscape. I thought we would take 2 hours to read the first chapter, but apparently we can finish it in an hour if I, try to minimize my angry chattering. So let us continue. Spanish conquest eventually wrought fundamental changes in the lives of the native population. The Spaniards introduced new customs and a new religion. They brought over new practices and institutions from their earlier experiences in Latin America. Basically, they trained themselves being colonizers there and brought it here. And even when they chose to retain certain indigenous social institutions, to serve colonial ends, the use of these institutions for purposes alien to native society transformed them in a profound way. Then, too, the presence of the new colonizers stimulated the influx of the Chinese, who, by their activities in catering to the needs of the Spaniards, became another factor for change in Philippine social and economic life. So remember, we said earlier, and maybe 2 streams ago, that before the Spanish came, we were already trading with the Chinese and many other countries that surround us. But it was incidental, meaning it's not really as organized as it should be, because we were basically in a subsistence economy. There was not much surplus to actually trade. Now, when the colonizers came and basically forced the Philippines to do all this mercantilist bullshit, there was more to trade because they were forced to produce more. And therefore, the Chinese also came in droves because it was business after all. Spaniards introduced new plants and animals which not only modified the eating habits of the natives, but also affected economic development, since some of these plants and animals were later produced commercially. Over the years, the galleons from Mexico brought Mexican corn, arrowroot, cassava and sweet potato, cotton and maguey, indigo and achuete, tobacco, cacao, peanut and cashew nut, pineapple, avocados, pepper, squash, tomato, lima bean, turnip, and eggplant. They also brought over from Mexico horses, cows, sheep, and goats, while water buffaloes, geese, and ducks and swans were imported from China and Japan. So there's a lot of new food and animals that came in. And I would like to note that, because this reminds me of a certain rich woman who brought in some animals from Africa to a certain island. This just makes me wonder, because if you bring new plants and more so new animals to a certain place where they're not originally from, you are disrupting the ecosystem, because now the plants and animals that originally grew and lived there have all these new other plants and animals that they have to compete with. Are they going to be prey or predators? So I can only imagine what happened. Colonial outpost. Although initially there were high expectations that the new colony would yield for the crown financial gains as bountiful as those extracted from America, these hopes were soon dissipated. The Spaniards did not find the same rich mines as they did in South America. There were no temples of Montezuma, nor edifices that housed vessels of gold, nor did they find an abundance of spices. In fact, as early as the year after Legazpi's arrival in Cebu, the abandonment of the archipelago was already being proposed. The colony was retained despite its lack of economic promise, because the religious were able to convince the royal court that the Philippines would be a valuable stepping stone to China and Japan. Besides being a prospective staging ground for missionary efforts in China, the islands were also useful as an outpost of empire. And we can still see this strategic location of the Philippines being at play even today, because that is why China wants to get some of the islands here, and then you have United States being very, very against it because they want to have their troops stationed here. It's a very strategic location when it comes to colonizing places or trading, etc. So even if they don't really have a lot of, you know, things to gain economically, they still continued. Spain was then engaged in continuous wars with the Dutch, the English, and the Portuguese, with ships built and manned by natives. The Spanish fleet sailed out of the islands to do battle in defense of the empire. Moreover, eager to duplicate their feat in the New World, the Spaniards entertained dreams of carving out an Oriental empire. The Philippines was to be the base for the conquest of neighboring nations. Yes, I do need rest. I will have that after the stream in maybe 45 minutes. I'm just coughing because I've been drinking cold coffee. Let's continue. Where was I? The Philippines was to be the base for the conquest of neighboring nations. The lack of riches ready to hand and the preoccupation with war and further conquest relegated to the Philippines to the role of a mere missionary and military way station. Let me just move it. This attitude was a factor that initially discouraged serious effort for economic development. A more basic factor was the mercantilist philosophy of the time, with its emphasis on trade. But for this purpose, the Philippines also suffered from a disadvantage. Its geographic isolation from Europe precluded the growth of direct trade with the rich countries of the continent and required that the islands be administered through Mexico. Up to the middle of the 18th century, therefore, the Philippine colony was not much more than a defense outpost in the east, ruled by a group of military administrators. These received a situado, an annual subsidy from Mexico. The rest of their needs had to be extracted from the population. Okay, economic neglect. Oh, thank you, Jotin Redwolf, for subscribing. Welcome to the stream. We are currently reading The Philippines, a past revisited by Renato Constantino. I am Bibi, I'm a moon-eating dragon, and I'm your professor today. Let's continue. Economic neglect. For 200 years, the Philippine economy remains largely underdeveloped economically, except for the limited effects of the activities of encomenderos and Spanish officials, and of the friars who settled in the provinces. One institution that also contributed to the relative lack of interest in developing the economy of the country was the Galleon Trade. This trade, which lasted for over 2 centuries up to 1815, involved only the Spaniards, who were concentrated in the city of Manila. It was essentially a trade between China and Mexico, with Manila as the transshipment port. Goods from China brought to Manila by junks were loaded in the galleons, and therefore it's called the Galleon Trade. It's the name of the type of ships that they used back then, and sent to Acapulco. The returning galleons brought back silver, which was highly appreciated in China. Very little of the produce in the country made its way to the Mexican market. Hence, the galleon trade did little to develop the islands. On the contrary, because of the quick returns from this trade, the Spaniards were further dissuaded from productive work and therefore neglected to develop the agricultural potential of the colony. So, yeah, nowadays you would hear that the Philippines are basically the Mexicans of Asia. It's because through the galleon trades, they not only exchanged goods between China and Mexico, there was a lot of exchange of culture. So, you know, our cultures are very, very similar. Also, just the fact that we were colonized by the same people makes the culture a little more, familiar. Let's continue. Moves for abandonment. The early proposals to abandon the Philippines was raised once more, this time for more definite financial and commercial reasons. One point made was that the colony was not self-supporting in as much as the duties collected on imports into New Spain by the galleons rarely compensated for the situado that the crown sent to Manila. In answer, proponents of the retention of the colony countered that a large part of the situado was used to finance the expeditions against the Moluccas, which was certainly not a legitimate expenditure of the Philippine colony. A more serious and significant objection to the retention of the colony was that of powerful commercial interests from Spain, particularly from the Andalusian cities. They supported the move for the abandonment of the Philippines because the Chinese silks brought to America by the Philippine galleons competed with their own exports to that region, thus seriously threatening the profits of the Spanish silk industry. So, they had their own reasons. It wasn't just that, the Philippines is not giving us as much profits as we thought they would. It's basically, oh, the trades are actually competing against ours. Seize it immediately. Okay, let's move. The compromise. In line with her mercantilist policy and responding to pressure from the merchants of Cadiz and Seville, Spain tried to save the trade of the American markets for Spanish manufacturers and to limit the outflow of silver from Mexico and Latin America to the east. Consequently, the galleon trade was restricted to only 2 ships a year, and it was granted only one port of entry in Mexico, which is Acapulco. Exports from Manila were pegged at 250,000 worth of goods, later raised to 500,000, and imports from Mexico were not supposed to exceed double the value of the exports. The intention was obviously to limit the revenue from the galleon trade to an amount adequate to maintain the Spanish establishment in the islands. As on previous occasions, the most powerful advocate of retention was, again, the Church, which by then had, besides its missionary undertakings, substantial material interest in the archipelago. The idea of a base for future maneuvers in the region continued to be a factor favoring preservation of the colony. There was also the prestige of the crown to be considered, as well as the pride of the Spanish kings in being the sovereigns of a city as prosperous as Manila at that time. The prosperity of Manila and its development as the single metropolis of the country, so it's the only actually developed place, was a byproduct of the galleon trade. The profits from this trade enabled Manila to construct its solid walls and imposing imposing buildings. And when we say Manila, we actually mean what we know nowadays as intramuros, therefore, the solid walls. So anything inside that wall back then, that is Manila, not the whole Manila that we know today. It kind of expanded. Some of the money made on the Galleon trade was bequeathed to religious orders to finance pious works, obras pias. Again, another term that should be familiar to all of you who started studying in the 90s, such as the establishment of schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions. Of course, the friars also borrowed heavily from the Obras Pias funds to finance their own participation in the lucrative galleon trade. Prosperity was evident in the abundance of luxury items for the persons and homes of the rich. By 1650, the population of the walled city, or the Intermuros, and its arrabales was approximately 42,000. Most of the Spaniards in the islands were concentrated in Intramuros, while a thriving Chinese community occupied the Parian in the suburbs. By the standards of the times and the region, Manila could indeed qualify as a principal city. So even then, in the Spanish era, Manila is already like basically the main city of the country. Plural economies. The prosperity of the Spanish community in Manila encouraged the influx of fairly large numbers of Chinese, as we talked about earlier. Before Manila became what it was, there were Chinese traders who came over now and then, but when it boomed, of course there were more Chinese people who wanted in on the trades. These Chinese constituted another factor which shaped the course of the colony's life and which was to have an enduring influence on the history of the country. Some historians contend that during the early part of the Spanish rule, three distinct economy systems existed in the Philippines: a Western economy, a native economy, and a Chinese economy. The principal preoccupation of the Western or Spanish economy was the galleon trade, which transshipped through Manila Chinese luxury goods to Mexico and Mexican silver to China. Some of these goods remained in the Philippines to satisfy the needs of the local community. Inasmuch the Philippine products were not in great demand in either China or Mexico, Philippine Spaniards did not find it profitable to develop local products for export. The native economy remained locally oriented and undeveloped. This is not to say, however, that the Spanish economy had no effect in it. For in the regions surrounding Manila and wherever there were Spanish communities, the mere fact of having to provide for the needs of these Spaniards certainly altered the native economy in various ways. The Chinese engaged in maritime trading between China and the Philippines, both as an adjunct to the galleon trade and to provide the local Spaniards with luxuries they required. Others worked as artisans, but the most important function of the Chinese, and the one with the greatest long-range impact on the country, was their role as intermediaries between the Western and the native economies. They distributed Chinese imports to the Philippine villages and gathered in return local products which they sold to the Spaniards. Now let's go more in depth with the roles of the Chinese in the Spanish era. Hold on, let me just move it a bit. Thank you for the stretch, Mino. And I will hydrate with coffee. Okay, let's begin. Although the Spanish, Chinese, and native economies, remember there were three, Impinged upon each other, they remained identifiably separate to the same extent that these three races lived as distinct cultural communities. This fact was recognized by the colonial administration, which classified residents as Spanish, Indio, or Chinese. When the 18th century racial by the eight- ah, again when by the 18th century racial intermarriage had produced a sizable group of Chinese mestizos, because you let people live together for enough time, of course they will intermarry. They too were classified separately as mestizos, so there was classification between people who lived there. The existence of these apparently separate economies did not negate the fact that all three were in varying degrees beginning to respond to a single underlying propulsive factor: the growing linkage of the country to world capitalism. Although this connection was not to become a compelling reality until the middle of the 18th century, in this development, the Chinese were to play a more vital role than the Spanish colonialists, for it was mainly the commercial activities of the Chinese in numerous towns and villages all over the country that accelerated the dissolution of the pre-conquest social patterns of the Filipinos. While the Spaniards were trying to graft their administrative institution into the indigenous social structures, the Chinese were wreaking havoc on the primitive economy of the natives. A case in point was the economic deterioration of Pampanga and Manila in the late 18th century. Rice production had fallen off and the local textile industry had declined disastrously. An investigation of the situation revealed that a sizable part of the rural population attracted by the money wages paid by the Spaniards had moved to the city to enter domestic service or provide such other services as Spaniards required. Instead of planting rice and weaving their own cloth, they were now buying their staple food and their clothing from the Chinese. Since the Chinese were also selling Chinese textiles in the province, the competition caused many local weavers to abandon this occupation. Reducciones. Okay. It must not be concluded, however, that official neglect of the colony's internal economy was accompanied by administrative indifferences. While the mercantilism of that period dictated in large part emphasis on trading activities rather than on internal economic development, the extraction of tribute and forced labor and the proselytizing tradition of Spanish colonization require the systematic extension of administrative control. For these reasons, the barangay had to be integrated into the colonial framework. Obviously, a few hundred friars and Spanish officials could not carry out their colonialist plans, while a population of approximately, again, 750,000 live in thousands of small communities scattered all over the islands. It was pretty hard to do. The remedy lay in the policy of resettlement or reducción, which would consolidate the population in larger villages. So, you remember when we discussed how the villages were back then, the barangays, they were like tiny little villages living parallel to the river or the seaside. And maybe there were like 30 to 100 families, or sometimes it was just 10 or 20 families living together. They can't really govern all of them at the same time because they were lacking in manpower. So what they did was they got all these barangays to move together in like larger villages so they can rule over them more efficiently. The reducción was part of the Spanish colonial experience in Latin America, which demonstrated that the Indians were more rapidly and efficiently organized for colonial purposes once they had been resettled in compact villages. This experience became the model for the Philippines, with the difference that whereas in Spain's American colonies resettlement was carried out jointly by church and state, reduction in the Philippines was mainly the work of the friars. Remember, we were on a phylocracy where the friars were in charge. But what seemed logical and desirable to the friars or to the government functionaries, given their own urban tradition and the requirements of colonization and conversion, was not so to the native population. They were subsistence, not surplus farmers, meaning they only planted what they needed. They didn't really plant to trade and gain riches, right? They needed to live close to the land they tilled and amid surroundings where they could easily hunt and fish to supplement their diet. And therefore, that's why they lived near the rivers or the oceans, because that's where their livelihood came from. To move to compact villages was highly impractical and contrary to their traditional life pattern. No wonder there was much hostility to the resettlement program of the Spaniards. The friars used a variety of techniques to gain native assent to resettlement. Some offer gifts of shirts, salts, needles, combs, and tabors. Others promise free housing within the reducciones. The novelty of mass participation in colorful church rites was another attraction. The government added its own blandishment in form of high-sounding titles and honors for the chiefs. If these enticements were insufficient to overcome barangay reluctance, friars were known to resort to threats and other pressures, meaning, if you don't move, we're gonna use violence on you. Quite often, barangays would elect resettlement out of fear, of course, of either encomenderos or soldiers. Aware of the power of ecclesiastical authorities, some sought protection from the oppression and cruelty of encomenderos and soldiers by joining settlements under the charge of the religious. Okay, let's just... Okay. So, population centers. I wanted to discuss how the change in the living area, like from little barangays to the little places where they were consolidated, also reflected the socio-economic stratifications, but I think it might be discussed here, so I will hold that off. Although the persistence of the friars did affect some urban concentration, Filipino opposition to reduction, besides delaying the process, also induced a compromise. The poblacion barrio sitio system, which prevails to this day. The church was the nucleus of each settlement complex, and the community in which it was located was called the cabecera. Due to the importance of the church and the Spanish colonial scheme, not only as a religious institution but as an economic and political force as well, it was to be expected that population would gravitate towards the edifice that symbolized its power. Cabeceras invariably become principal population centers or poblaciones. Surrounding each poblacion were subordinate villages, or barrios, and still smaller communities called sitios. Their existence was evidence of the resistance of the Filipinos to settle far from their fields. The friars adapted themselves to this fact of Philippine life by constructing chapels in the larger villages. These came to be called visitas, from the practice of the friars for making periodic visits to these villages to say mass and impart the Christian doctrine. You can still see this to this day. Like, they would go to little chapels in like barangays, because nowadays we have a different notion of what a barangay is. And yes, let's just discuss this quickly. Before the Spaniards came and before the Reducción, the Filipinos, again, they lived near water, like parallel to it, facing the water, because it's their main way of transportation and their main basically source of food, like fish and other aquatic animals that they can eat, aside from, maybe planting. And when they plant, it's also their source of water. So back then, you can see that the houses were like aligned, which also kind of reflects that they're all equals. Even if you are, let's say, a leader of a certain barangay, you would not be in the center of the barangay because you're all like facing the water, your houses are. But when the Reducción happened, the church became the middle of it all. Like, if you would notice the current layout of, especially those towns that are not as urbanized, like, for example, my town, the one that I live in now, the center would be like the plaza. This is your main place where your people gather, and then around the plaza you would see all the important quote-unquote buildings of the town, which is your church, the school, maybe the market, anything and everything that the people will usually visit. It all surrounds that one place. And further than that, you will see houses of rich people who can afford land near the church. So it might be worth noting that, the closer your house is to the church, it kind of says that, oh, you might be richer. Because the further away you are, in the smaller sitios, you will have smaller little huts. That came from the Spanish. Oh, of course the angel lives near the church. But yes, so our current town layout, it's a remnant of the Reducción. And you can also tell by how we name our barangays now. Like, for example, you have poblaciones. Why are there so many poblacion centro, poblacion north, east, west, and south? It came from the poblaciones formed during the Reducción, because, you have your center, which is basically the town plaza and all the buildings that are important, including the church, most importantly the church, and then the poblaciones around it is like basically your what do you call this, area where you can live. And further away from it, you have your sitios where the farmers would live, so that they can live nearer where they farm. And if you would compare that to the more equal standing of the people in the era where there were only small barangays that are not the barangays that we know today, again, it's a different type of barangay. You can clearly see the stratification in terms of socio-economic standing. You just have to look at how far away they are from the nucleus, the center, the church. Now, let's continue. Okay, acceleration of stratification. Besides facilitating Catholic indoctrination, resettlement opened the way for closer administrative control and supervision. It was not long before the growing population centers were given political and economic functions. In the process of consolidating their religious and political control of these reducciones, religious and civil authorities put into effect policies that accelerated the process of stratification which had already begun operating in pre-conquest society. Reduction itself was achieved in part through the application of positive inducements or pressures on the chiefs and their families, thus acknowledging and therefore confirming their higher status and authority. Missionaries worked on chiefs and their families to move to the cabeceras so that they might set the example for the others. So that's why, the richer people, the descendants of those chiefs, are in the cabeceras, the main cities, the places nearer to church. Their presence at the cabecera, that is at the center of the colonial power in that locality, provided these chiefs with opportunities to further entrench themselves in positions of dominance within the native community. Spanish administrative policy, being itself the expression of a hierarchical society, was committed to the preservation of traditional authority of the chiefs within the barangay, but this time under Spanish direction and control. Spanish colonial experience in Latin America had demonstrated the efficacy of incorporating the native hierarchy of authority within the colonial administration. This ensured a measure of social continuity which facilitated acceptance of foreign rule. Using the barangay as the basic unit of local administration, the Spaniards recruited barrio and poblacion officials from the ranks of the chieftains or cabezas de barangay. By confirming their political authority, the Spaniards converted most of the local chieftains into willing allies and useful intermediaries between themselves and the people. These chieftains and their families formed a ready reservoir of reliable minor civil servants whose former status was now bolstered by colonial recognition, as evidenced by their title of principales. Colonial intermediaries. The highest position open to Filipinos in the civil government was that of the gobernadorcillo or petty governor, a position roughly equivalent that of a town mayor today. So basically, gobernadorcillo, it's kind of like mayor. In return for exemption from paying tribute and from rendering forced labor, the gobernadorcillo was entrusted with the duty of collecting the tributes within his jurisdiction. Such tributes were supposed to tally with census estimates, which, not being regularly updated, often included persons already dead. This was an additional burden which had to be shouldered by the gobernadorcillo unless he could pass it on to the relatives of the deceased. Needless to say, he was also held accountable for unpaid tributes or delayed payments, inasmuch as the law set a definite date of their turnover. Failure to deliver the required sum subjected the gobernadorcillo to a fine of imprisonment. It was also his responsibility to spend for the maintenance of the municipal guards and the jail, free the prisoners, supply the municipal government with personnel and supplies. The entertainment of visiting functionaries was likewise borne by him. So it's not just some fancy title. There was a lot of things that they need to do, that it's a great burden. Although many gobernadorcillo ended his term in penury because of the expenses he had to shoulder and the unpaid tributes he had to make good, it was likewise true that the situation was made to order for others who wished to enrich themselves by exacting more tribute than was required, and by other illegal means such as granting tribute exemptions in consideration of gifts or personal services. So since it was already straining on them, a lot of them can and will abuse their position to get more tribute or tax, more than necessary, because they have to pay for those who are already dead. And basically, yes, human greed. Another function of the gobernadorcillo discharge was that of mobilizing labor for government construction projects. This power was also susceptible to abuses such as the confiscation of the wages of polo laborers and the utilization of their labor for his personal benefit. So, if you would remember, the polistas were paid very little. And then you have a gobernadorcillo who might not be giving them the payment that they're supposed to get. And on top of that, he could tell them to, do work for him for his own benefit, not for whatever project that they're actually supposed to do. The foregoing also held true, though on a smaller scale, for the cabezas de barangay. So yes, the islands were rife with corruption, from the Spanish to the natives that they assigned in power. Third prop of power. To the twin supports for their leadership, namely their traditional barangay authority and the political privileges granted by the Spaniards, the Principalia, or, the chieftains and their families, who were now basically sanctioned by the Spanish crown as some people who were higher than the other natives, soon added a third prop, that of economic power, beginning their economic rise by exploiting the possibilities of their administrative offices. These intermediaries between the Spanish colonizer and the masses of the people further consolidated their economic position by taking advantage of the opportunities opened to them by the concept of private property in land, which the Spaniards introduced. Because remember, before the Spaniards came, land was communal. The leaders or the chiefs of the barangays did not own the land. Individuals did not own the land either. They were owned by the society, by the barangay, and they were just assigned. They were allowed to use it, but it was a communal property. And the Spaniards introduced the concept of private property. In the pre-conquest barangays, they actually discussed it. Land was communally owned and was not regarded as a source or a measure of wealth. While Spanish laws initially recognized the communal system of land ownership because, they don't want people owning the land. It should belong to the king. The fact that the colonizers introduced the concept of individual land ownership and regarded the land itself not merely for its use as a source of wealth was bound to change native ideas on this point. Appropriation of communal holdings. By virtue of their position as administrative and fiscal middlemen between the Spaniards and their own people, the Principales were the ones most likely to become aware of this concept and to recognize its financial advantages to themselves. Furthermore, they already had some experience with the administrative and legal machinery. Since they retained their traditional authority over the communal lands, it was relatively simple to secure formal ownership of these land holdings, or at least of those portions which their dependents habitually cultivated. Mindful of the Principalia's usefulness as the conduit of colonial power, the Spaniards seldom placed any obstacles to such acquisitions. Unfair to the people thought this might be, A pertinent example was the Jesuit purchase in 1603 of land in Quiapo. Yes, Quiapo, the place with the famous church and many fortune tellers in front of it. Yes, that Quiapo. Then a village in the suburbs of Manila. The Jesuits bought the land from some local chiefs, whereupon the villagers protested, since the land they claimed belonged to the barangay and not the chieftains. Again, it was a communal property. But despite the support of Archbishop Benavides, the villagers were not able to annul the sale and expel the Jesuits. The trend toward individual ownership with legal title accelerated during the 17th century, when more and more chieftains appropriated the lands cultivated by their dependents, and these tillers were institutionalized as tenants. Resultant stratifications. Economic and political standing conferred social prestige. Moreover, the Principality sought perpetuation of its dominant status through intra-class marriage. The physical expression of the socio-economic ascendancy was the existence of Principalia residences in the plaza complex. The buildings around the town plaza of each poblacion nicely reflected the hierarchy of status in colonial society. This is the one that we discussed earlier. So the nearer you are in the plaza complex, the higher your status is. With the church, convent, and the municipio or seat of civil authority dominating the square. That residences of principales were more and more frequently located at or near the plaza was suggestive of their growing importance as well as of their increasing stratification of native society. The intermediaries between the colonizers and the native population were becoming more closely identified with the colonial power, as well separated them from the rest of their countrymen. By 1800s, rural society was characterized by a three-tiered hierarchy consisting of Spanish priest, principalia, and masses. In Manila and its suburbs, the hierarchy had 5 levels: Spaniards, Chinese mestizos, native principales, Chinese, and the people. The 5 social groups in that order also represented the stratification in terms of economic power. This stratification persisted well into the beginning of the 19th century, with the Spanish clergy constituting the leading instrument of power and vehicle for exploitation. Okay, this is where we will stop. We have read 2 chapters today. We might continue. Wait, what day is it today? Today is Thursday, tomorrow is Friday. I think tomorrow we will be doing something else because, yeah, we're reading this twice a week. I'm thinking about setting my schedule like at 9 a.m. regularly every day on weekdays. I have not yet actually planned my schedule on the weekends. Hold on, let me just go back to my just chatting screen. There we go. So, oh yes, thank you for the stretch. I like this 3D model because you can actually see me stretching. Let me turn and stretch my back on both directions. Yeah. Now my neck. Thank you. Did you listen well, ducklings? Did you learn anything from our stream? How was it? Let me just drink some more of my coffee. So now we have learned a lot more about how our ancestors lived during, the beginnings and to- in the middle of the Spanish era. So, before this, we already discussed how they lived before. Now, you can compare it to what they were during the Spanish era. So, from basically equal society, they started having a lot of stratification, and this does not really just apply to social, well, economic status and social status. It also applies to gender. So prior to the Spanish rule, we had babaylans. My body that I'm inhabiting right now used to belong to a babaylan, and they were mostly female, although there were those who basically function as women in the society to be priestess. Yes. So the priestesses, or well, obviously, when I say priestess, they were women. They held power and prestige. But when the Spanish came, well, they were kind of demonized, and basically they were called witches, and women were deemed subservient to men. Back then, we had a more equal society where men and women had different roles. You can still actually see this in groups of like indigenous groups that were basically not colonized, like, up in the mountains in Bontoc. They respected women. And there are even gender, as in like how we view it today, it was kind of different. There were tribes that recognized transgender people, and it was basically similar to how the modern society would view transgender people as their preferred gender, because back then gender is not what's between your pants. It's basically a social construct as how you were viewed in society. So for example, for the Teduray, I don't really know how to pronounce it. I'm really sorry. Um, they had this concept of wait, let me research what it's called because I forgot about the term. Man, I forgot if this is the correct term, but I will. Oh, okay. So the Teduray language, there is a word called mente fuale, or one who becomes. So when you say mente fuale libun, so one who becomes a woman. So that is their term for a person who was born in a male body, or assigned male at birth, but decided or realized that they are a woman. So to them, that is valid. They are allowed to do that. And when this, I forgot the name. Let me just search it up real quick. It's just a very, very quick segue. Let me read this. This is in vice.com. So, deep in the rainforests of Mindanao, Philippines, there's an indigenous group whose beliefs and practices towards transgender members of their community were much more progressive than they are in the country today, because, we kind of regressed in that department when the Spanish came here with their Catholic values. The group is called Teduray, and we can learn a lot about them from one anthropologist's account of the life and culture of one of its villages. In the book Wisdom from a Rainforest, The Spiritual Journey of an Anthropologist, and the essay on Growing Up a Boy in America, Stuart Skagel tells the story of a bamboo zither player named Uka, who was considered Mentefuale Libon. So that was the term that I was saying earlier, one who becomes a woman. In the Teturay language, Mentefuale means one who becomes, and Libon means woman. So Mentefuale Libon means one who becomes a woman. Schlegel wrote that he also met a man who was born a woman, or Mentefuale Lage. LGBTQ discrimination is still common here in the Philippines. Um, if you would remember, what year is this? Last year, a woman, oh no, a trans man was murdered, and several lesbian women were allegedly shamed by having their heads shaved in public. I think I've seen a video of that. Advocates are pushing for a bill to, protect the discrimination, or, what we call the Soji bill. And I will not discuss it, but maybe some other time because we have a different topic here. Let me just move on to. According to Schlegel's account, he was confused by the bamboo zither player, Uka. He asked his guides because, he was studying the people and he had guides who would translate for him. So he asked his guides in the community questions about her, like if she was a man dressed a woman, a cross-dresser, and what genitals she had. And I must note that this was, I forgot what year this is, but this was like, before we became politically correct and respectful to people's genders. So those were the types of questions that he asked. He told them that in the United States, where he was from, women and men who wanted to be another gender were despised and considered bad. So that, just a background of how it was. The Teduray were puzzled. So clearly, they didn't do that there. Both by Schlegel's question and the information about how trans people were treated in the United States, because for them, Uka and other Mentefuale or Tentu, Uka and other Mentefuale are real. So their term was Tentu Libon, like real women. The Teduray saw Mentefuale Libon as real women and Mentefuale Lage as real men. One of Schlegel's frustration was that his informants were also not interested in talking about Mentefuale, like it's something, just very casual and natural to them. Said Kenneth Milondaga, an assistant professor of anthropology in the University of the Philippines, Mindanao. For them, it is not something to talk about. The Mentefuale Libon are just, regular part of the community. The chapter on the Mentefuale in Schlegel's book is all of 6 pages long. Milondaga guessed that part of the reason that chapter was so short was that for the Teduray, transness was simply not a big deal. In Teduray culture, gender was not determined by biological attributes, but by what people identified as and the role they played in society. Schlegel wrote that the Teduray did not discriminate on the basis of sex. Milondaga said, referencing Schlegel's account. It's not hard to imagine then that there were Mentefuale who were not just artists like Uka. We can say Mentefuale were involved in economic activities too. There was, however, one thing the Mentefuale could not do, which is to get married. And we will get to that later on, why they don't get married, because marriage is a different concept to them. The worldview of the Teduray, okay, here it is, was that marriage is equivalent to reproduction. So basically, if you want to get married, you're saying that you want to have children with this person. So that's the exception of the Mentefuale. So since they can't really have kids with their partners, they can't really get married, but they are allowed to have partners. They will not be discriminated against. Aside from that, Mentefwali were just treated like anybody else. Schlegel noticed that a likely reason the group was so accepting of people identifying as a gender different from the one they were assigned at birth was that neither men nor women held a higher status in society. So this is what I was talking about. Um, we had like a more equal society back then, not just in terms of socio-economic, also the gender. Men did the heavy physical work in their cultivation systems, such as cutting down the big trees, while women weeded. But nobody valued felling trees as a higher work than weeding, wrote Schlegel. Otherwise, all social statuses were open equally to men and women, however prestigious, shamans, legal sages, and healers. Vilandaga teaches her students about the Mentefwali to show them that trans people were accepted in local Filipino communities in the past and that our very own ancestors did not discriminate against them. The notion of trans is not new. We have examples that came from indigenous peoples' communities. So I think it's very important to always include the story of Uka, especially when we talk about gender in the context of Mindanao, she said. Mindanao is one of the three major islands groups of the Philippine archipelago. UP Mindanao's only LGBTQ organization is called UP Mindanao Mentefwale, adopting the term to show that acceptance of the LGBTQ community is not a Western concept. We were already accepting of it before they came. And I would just like to note that if you would notice, it's in Mindanao. Because why? Mindanao was not really colonized the way Luzon and to an extent Visayas was, because the Moros were fighting the Spanish, and also I think the Teduray are like living in a higher place up in the mountains. So those areas up in the mountains, it's also harder for them to colonize, because even here in Luzon and Visayas, the mountains were like places they don't really go to. That's why the people who are like basically hiding from the Spanish government went to the mountains. Okay, let me just continue reading. We have the indigenous knowledge of homosexuality and transness that is unique to our culture. Malaya Lapina, an anthropology student and member of the organization, told Vice. Thanks to the student-led organization, Milandaga said discussions on gender have become more accessible to her students. Students think the term Mentefwale is gay lingo, a made-up term, so learning its origins is a eureka moment for them, she said, adding that this nugget of knowledge piques her students' interests and usually leads to some of the liveliest class discussions. The Teduray still exists as a people today, but according to Milondaga, the Teduray village Schlegel lived with and wrote about has since dispersed due to conflicts with another community. At the moment, it's difficult to determine if the Teduray still treat their Mentefwale the way they did in Schlegel's accounts, she said. It's one thing that the anthropologists should study again, especially anthropologists in the Philippines, Milondaga added. Lapino thinks learning about how Mentefwale were treated in the past can help bring understanding and acceptance of the trans community in the present. It's really beautiful to revisit to learn about this indigenous knowledge of sexuality, she said. I think it's very helpful for starting a discussion in accepting LGBTQ people among Filipinos. This was written by Romana Santos on Vice.com, but I think when I first read this, it's not this specific one. I read about Uka some years ago, and her story really stuck in my mind because it correlates to how colonization has changed the way society in general here in the Philippines worked. Hold on. Let me just back read what is going on in my chat. I kept on talking. Mommy, since you and Mino are siblings, is Mr. Mino also inhabiting a vessel, or is that his real body? Okay, Mino answered. Yes, I'm in the body of a traveling merchant. Mino, the traveling gamer, Myon said. Hello, hello, hello. Thank you for dropping by. Oh, yes, class is more important. Anyway, you can still come back to my stream whenever you want to. It will be here on my Twitch for 2 weeks, and after that, you can still access it because I do upload the VODs on my YouTube channel. If you still haven't subscribed, look for BB Bakunawa on YouTube, and you can still listen to and watch my previous streams. So, yeah, enough about me blabbering. That would be basically that's all for today. I have talked more than I need to. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed listening to our stream. Tomorrow I will be streaming. I'm not really sure what I'm going to stream. I'm going to look for a game, either Gris or maybe I would try tax what's tax evader what is that game again that we were playing yesterday that I rage quit and started. I rage quit yesterday because it was so hard. Oh, hold on. I forgot the name of the game. Let's look. Oh, Tax Fugitive. So yes, either I will try Tax Fugitive again, or I will be trying Gris, or maybe Helltaker. You know, let's get some horned waifus aside from me. What else can we do? If I am strong enough, I could try and confront my foes in Minecraft. And when I say my foes, I mean the fucking stupid ass drowns who have killed me multiple times and made me lose a lot of my items. Maybe, just maybe. But either way, you will be seeing me again tomorrow, 9 o'clock, same time, same place. And actually, that is all. Let us look for someone that we can raid. Let's just look for it. Hold on, what is Magindara sending me? What is this sussy content? Hold on. What? Magindara, why? Let me just look for a channel to raid. All right, let's go. Oh, you know what? I'm going to send you all to Magindara. So as usual, our raid message is BB raid, or no, Bakunawa raid. And if you are subscribed to me, we have a raid emote that you can use. So yes, thank you again for joining me this morning. I hope you learned something. I will be seeing you again tomorrow, but until then, au revoir, adios, annyeong, sampai jumpa, zaijian, sayonara, paalam, BB bye bye. Raid going in 3, 2, 1. Let us go.